The door to the schoolhouse burst open with a force that rattled every window pane in Caldwell Creek, and Patrick Graves stood in the frame like a man who had already made his peace with leaving. "It's over," he said, his voice low and raw, the kind of voice that had crossed 100 miles of broken country and still carried weight. "Harlan Voss rides in tomorrow morning with 20 armed men and a deed signed by the territorial governor himself. I've seen his kind do this before. I've seen whole towns emptied out like barrels at the end of a drought. Pack what you can carry, Miss Finley. That's the only honest advice I have left to give you." Rose Finley did not look up from the papers spread across her desk. The lantern threw gold across her dark hair and her steady hands, and she went right on writing, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the room besides the wind pushing against the walls. "You've given your advice," she said. "I didn't ask for it. You didn't ask for Harlan Voss either, and yet here he comes." Now she looked up, and when her eyes met his, Patrick Graves felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, not the old familiar exhaustion that had been his companion since Abilene, something sharper than both of those things together. "Sit down, Mr. Graves," Rose said, setting her pen aside with calm deliberation, "and let me tell you exactly what is going to happen in Caldwell Creek tomorrow morning." He didn't sit down. Men like Patrick Graves didn't sit down easily in places that felt like they might collapse. But he didn't leave either, and that was the most important thing that had happened to him in 3 years. That moment, that single suspended moment in the lantern-lit schoolhouse with the wind howling outside and a woman who refused to blink, was where the story truly bent. To understand how Patrick Graves and Rose Finley arrived at that threshold together, you had to go back 6 days, to the afternoon he rode into Caldwell Creek on a gray horse with a cracked saddle and a reputation for passing through. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Caldwell Creek sat in the Kansas plains like a sentence that hadn't finished being written yet. It had a main street of packed red dirt, a general store run by a man named Emil Hobart who was missing his left index finger, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a saloon called the Dusty Angel, and a schoolhouse at the eastern edge of town that was newer than everything else combined. The population hovered somewhere between 90 and 100 souls, depending on whether you counted the Mercer family who lived 3 miles out and came to town twice a month for supplies. Patrick Graves counted none of them as he rode in. He counted exits. He always counted exits. He was 31 years old, though he sometimes felt twice that, and he had the kind of face that the plains had worked like leather over fire, dark-eyed and weathered, with a jaw that hadn't met a razor in 4 days. He had been a ranch hand in Texas, a cattle driver along the Kishom Trail, a deputy in a town that no longer existed, and a drifter in all the space between those things. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip, not because he was looking for trouble, but because trouble had a habit of finding him regardless. He pulled up at the livery stable and a boy of about 12 came out to take his horse. "What's your name?" Patrick asked. "Jimmy Hobart," the boy said, eyeing the horse with the appreciation of someone who understood animals. "Emil's son." "Yes, sir. Your father owned the general store." "He does. But Miss Finley owns the town, near as I can tell," Jimmy said with great seriousness, and Patrick looked at him for a moment before deciding the boy meant it as a compliment rather than a complaint. "Is there a hotel?" "Mrs. Calloway rents rooms above the hardware store. 2 bits a night. She makes biscuits in the morning." Patrick paid for the horse's board and walked to Mrs. Calloway's, and he ate biscuits he hadn't tasted the equal of in 4 years, and he slept on a mattress that was only moderately hostile, and he told himself he would ride out the next morning once he had restocked his supplies. He didn't ride out the next morning. He woke to the sound of voices carrying from the direction of the general store, and from long habit, he dressed quickly and stepped outside onto the narrow board walkway, and that was the first time he saw Rose Finley. She was standing in the middle of the main street, which was frankly the most dangerous place to stand in any frontier town, addressing Emil Hobart and a small assembly of men with the kind of ease that suggested she had been standing in dangerous places her whole life and found them perfectly comfortable. She was 27 years old, with dark eyes that seemed to be reading every person in front of her simultaneously, and she stood with her shoulders back and her chin level, and she was talking about water rights. Specifically, she was talking about the creek that ran along the northern edge of the Voss Ranch, the creek that Caldwell Creek had been named for, and that the town had relied on for 8 years. The creek that, according to a surveyor's report she was holding in her left hand, Harlan Voss was claiming as his exclusive property under a fraudulent easement filing in the territorial capital. He cannot legally restrict the town's access, Rose was saying, her voice carrying clean and clear in the morning air. The easement he filed references a survey map from 1874, but the original homestead claims in this county predate that survey by 2 years. If those prior claims are still on record in Topeka, and I have every reason to believe they are, his filing doesn't hold. Reason to believe isn't the same as knowing for certain, said a man Patrick didn't recognize, a heavy-set farmer with sunburnt arms and a worried expression. No, Rose agreed, which is why I've written to the county land office. I sent the letter 3 days ago. In the meantime, Harlan Voss does not own this creek, and he does not own this town, and I would very much appreciate it if we all agreed to stop acting as though he already does. Patrick leaned against the post outside Mrs. Calloway's and watched this woman hold the attention of 12 worried men through nothing but the force of her clarity, and he felt something he identified, after a moment's consideration, as professional respect. He found out more about Rose Finley over the course of that day. She had come to Caldwell Creek 3 years ago from Lawrence, Kansas, where she had studied at the State University, an unusual achievement for a woman of that era, and one she had fought for without apology. She had been hired as the town's schoolteacher at a salary that was frankly insulting, and had negotiated it upward by presenting the town council with a written comparison of teacher salaries across 6 Kansas counties. She taught 31 children ranging in age from 5 to 14, and she was reported to be excellent at it, though her methods sometimes startled parents who had expected rote memorization and received instead geometry, logic, and the fundamentals of land law. She had also, in the 3 years since her arrival, learned to survey land. This was the thing that would matter most, though Patrick didn't know it yet. He also didn't know yet about the dark past that Harlan Voss was carrying with him into Caldwell Creek, or the trap that was about to close around everyone who lived there. Harlan Voss was 53 years old and had been acquiring land in the Kansas plains by methods that were technically legal and deeply dishonest for approximately 2 decades. He was not a violent man by preference, but he employed violent men by practice, and the distinction had never seemed to trouble him. He had broken 4 smaller ranchers in Pawnee County the previous year, and he had done it without a single gunshot by simply controlling their water access until their cattle died and their credit dried up and they had no choice but to sell at whatever price he offered. He had been watching Caldwell Creek for 18 months. The creek was what he wanted. The town was what was in the way. On the second day of Patrick's unplanned stay in Caldwell Creek, the first of Voss's men rode through. He was a lean fellow on a good horse, and he stopped at the saloon and had a drink and talked to nobody in particular, which was how Patrick knew he was gathering information rather than passing through. Patrick had done enough of that kind of work himself in his deputy days to recognize the shape of it. He followed the man out of the saloon at a polite distance and watched him ride south, toward the Voss Ranch. And then Patrick walked to the schoolhouse because the day was a school day and he needed to think. And for reasons he could not immediately explain, the schoolhouse seemed like the right place to do it. He stood outside the open window for a few minutes, listening without intending to, and what he heard stopped him entirely. Rose Finley was teaching her students surveying mathematics, not as an abstraction. She had a simplified theodolite on her desk, a real instrument, and she was walking the older children through the process of establishing a baseline measurement and calculating angles, using the field behind the schoolhouse as their subject. Her explanations were precise and patient and occasionally funny, and the children were riveted in the way that children are riveted only when a teacher has genuinely made something matter. "Why do we need to know this?" asked a girl's voice. "Because land is the foundation of everything your family has in this place," Rose said, without hesitation. "And if you cannot read a survey, you cannot defend what's yours. You have to be able to look at a map and know if it's telling you the truth." Patrick walked away from the window feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't fully name. He went to the saloon and drank one whiskey, and he thought about the lean man on the good horse, and he thought about Harlan Voss's track record, and he thought about whether it was any of his business. It was not, strictly speaking, any of his business. He had not been hired. He had no stake in this town. He had no people here. He was a drifter, and drifters survived by having no stake in any particular acre of ground, because stakes were what got men killed. He drank his whiskey and ordered another, and he was halfway through it when Emil Hobart sat down across from him, unbidden, and said, "You look like a man who's been somewhere." "I've been several places," Patrick said. "I mean somewhere that had trouble in it," Emil said. He looked at Patrick steadily from under his hat brim. "Jimmy told me about your horse. He said a man who takes care of a horse the way you do has spent real time on the trail. I was wondering what kind." "Cattle mostly," Patrick said. "Some law work," Emil nodded slowly. "We might be needing people who have done law work," he said. "Harlan Voss is not a man who stops at letters and legal arguments." "What does he stop at?" "We're hoping to find out before he arrives," Emil said. Patrick set down his glass. "When does he arrive?" "We're not certain. His man came through today. I'd guess within the week." Patrick looked at the amber in his glass for a long moment. "I'm passing through," he said. "I know," Emil said. "I'm just letting you know the situation in case you're passing through slowly." That night Patrick ate dinner alone at the boarding house and tried to read the dime novel he'd been carrying for 2 months and failed. And then he lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a town he'd been deputy of 3 years ago that had been broken by a man with money and patience and hired guns. He had not been able to save that town. He had not even been there at the end, because by then he had already moved on, and the guilt of that moving on had become one of the permanent weights he carried. He got up before dawn and went for a walk that took him past the schoolhouse, which he had not intended, and he found Rose Finley outside it at first light, on her knees in the grass beside a wooden stake she had driven into the ground, holding a compass and making notes in a field book. She didn't look up when he stopped. "You're surveying," he said. "I am. At 5 in the morning. The light is clear and the ground is soft enough to take stakes properly," she said, as though these were obvious facts that required no defense. "Also, the children aren't here yet. Once school starts, I have 31 responsibilities, and surveying requires concentration." He looked at the stake, and then at the small theodolite set up 6 feet away, which was the same instrument he had seen through the window the day before. "What are you surveying?" Now she looked up, and her expression was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were watchful. "The eastern boundary of the original town plat," she said. "The one filed in 1874 with the county. I want to verify that the corners are where the document says they are, because Harlan Voss's surveyor filed a competing plat last spring that places the eastern boundary 300 feet west of where it actually is, which would, conveniently, put the creek entirely outside the town's legal jurisdiction." Patrick was quiet for a moment. "You think his survey is fraudulent?" "I think his surveyor is employed by a man who has spent 20 years filing creative paperwork," Rose said. "Whether the fraud was in the original measurements or the recorded numbers, I intend to find out." "Do you know how to do that accurately? Survey, I mean. It's not a skill most people have." She straightened up and looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been underestimated her whole life and has learned to find it almost interesting. My father was a civil engineer who built bridges for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, she said. I grew up with a surveying compass in my hand. I completed my own survey of this township last summer, and I intend to have the measurements independently verified by the county before Harlan Voss arrives. The county office is 40 miles away, Patrick said, which is why I was planning to ride there tomorrow, Rose said, turning back to her compass. By yourself. Unless you have a better idea, Mr. Graves, which you are welcome to share or keep to yourself. Either way, I'll be setting out at dawn. Patrick stood there in the early morning light and watched her work, and he felt the scales inside him tip slowly towards something he'd been avoiding for 3 years. I'll ride with you, he said. Rose looked at him again, evaluating. Why? Because 40 miles is a long way to ride alone in a county where Harlan Voss employs men, he said, and because I used to be in law enforcement and I don't like fraudulent land claims. She studied him for a moment longer. Can you keep up? I ride fast. I can keep up. Then meet me here at sunrise, Rose said, and went back to her compass. They rode out the next morning into the flat autumn gold of the Kansas plains, and the sky was enormous above them. That particular western sky that makes a person feel simultaneously small and clarified. Rose rode a bay mare with a confident pace and sat the saddle like someone who had grown up on horseback, which, as she explained somewhere around the first hour, she had. Her father had believed that physical capability was not divided by sex and had raised his only daughter accordingly. He sounds like an unusual man, Patrick said. He was the best person I ever knew, Rose said, and there was something in her voice that closed the subject gently, without shutting Patrick out entirely, and he respected the boundary without pressing it. They talked about many things over those 40 miles, and the talking had the quality of two people who have both been lonely for a long time and are discovering that the other person is worth the risk of words. Rose told him about Lawrence, about the university, about the professor who had initially refused to admit her to the engineering mathematics course, and how she had gone over his head to the department chairman, with a written argument so thorough that the chairman had not only admitted her, but eventually hired her as a teaching assistant. Patrick told her about the Kisham Trail, about the cattle drives that had the grandeur of a great motion and the daily reality of dust and heat, and keeping men from killing each other over card games. He told her about being a deputy in a town called Millhaven, which was honest work that he'd been proud of. He didn't tell her about leaving Millhaven before the end. He wasn't ready for that yet. The hidden weight of that old betrayal of himself sat in his chest where it always sat, and he let it sit. The county land office in Pratt was staffed by a nervous clerk named Aldous who wore spectacles and had ink permanently on his left hand. Rose walked in and presented herself with such direct authority that Aldous immediately sat up straighter and began looking for files. What she was looking for were the original homestead filings from 1872 and 1873, the ones that predated the official survey of the township. If those filings specified the creek as a boundary, they would establish prior claim that superseded anything Voss's surveyor had recorded in 1874. Aldous found the files, and he brought them out, and Rose spread them on the counter and began reading with the focused intensity of someone who has spent years learning to read exactly this kind of document. Patrick watched her from a few feet away, leaning against the wall, and he watched the way her finger moved along the text, precise and certain, and the way she cross-referenced two documents simultaneously, holding one up and reading from the other, and the way she occasionally made a small, sharp sound under her breath when she found something significant. After 45 minutes she looked up and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite triumph, but was very close to it. The Morrison homestead claim from June of 1872, she said, specifies the eastern boundary of the claim as the east bank of the creek running north-south through the property, said creek being the natural boundary between the Morrison claim and the open range to the east. That's prior claim. That's on record here in the county files, dated 2 years before Voss's surveyor ever touched this land. That means what exactly? Aldous asked, because he had become genuinely interested. It means that when the town of Caldwell Creek was incorporated using the Morrison land as its original base, the creek's east bank was already established as the western edge of public territory, Rose said. Voss's survey can move lines on paper all it wants. This document says the creek belongs to the public easement, and this document is older. She asked Aldous for certified copies of the relevant filings. He provided them. She paid the copying fee out of her own money, which Patrick noticed, and folded the papers carefully into the leather satchel she carried on her saddle. They rode back toward Caldwell Creek as the afternoon deepened, and the light turned from gold to copper, and the wind carried the first breath of real autumn cold. "You know this isn't necessarily enough," Patrick said. It needed saying, and he said it directly, because she deserved directness. A county filing is one thing. Harlan Voss has a deed signed by the territorial governor. He has 20 armed men. He may not care what the county records say. He doesn't have to care, Rose said, her voice level. He has to be stopped from acting before we can get a judge to look at these documents. Voss is relying on speed and intimidation. If Caldwell Creek hasn't crumbled by the time a judge sees this evidence, we win. This is only lost if we give up first. And if he comes in with 20 men before the judge arrives, then we need to make sure he finds something in Caldwell Creek that isn't what he's expecting, she said. He expects a frightened town. We need to give him something else. Patrick looked at her profile against the fading western light, the clean lines of her face, the absolute steadiness of her jaw, and felt something shift in the center of him, the way a lodestone shifts when it finally finds true north. "What are you planning?" he asked. "I'm going to talk to every person in Caldwell Creek," she said. "Every single one. I'm going to explain exactly what we found today and exactly what it means. And then I'm going to ask them a question." "What question?" "Whether they want their town back," Rose said simply. They arrived back in Caldwell Creek after dark, and Rose went directly to the church and asked Emil Hobart to ring the bell. And when Patrick raised an eyebrow at the hour, she told him that when something important needed saying, the right time to say it was immediately, not in the morning when fear had had all night to grow. The bell brought people out of their homes with lanterns, confused and then attentive. 30 adults assembled in the church, and Rose stood at the front of them and told them what she had found in Pratt. She explained the prior claim documents. She explained why they mattered. She explained exactly what Harlan Voss's legal position was, and exactly what the town's legal position was, and she did it in language clear enough for everyone to follow. Then she said, "We need to send a writer to Dodge City tonight to get this documentation in front of a federal judge. We need the judge to issue a stay of any action Voss attempts to take until the matter is reviewed. That writer needs to ride hard and get there before Voss arrives here. I need a volunteer who can make 45 miles in the dark." A young man named Cole Ferris, who was 22 and owned the fastest horse in the county, stood up before she'd finished the sentence. "I'll go," he said. Rose nodded. "Thank you, Cole. Emil, can you draft the request for judicial review? I'll walk you through exactly what it needs to say." Then she turned to the rest of the assembly, and her voice did not soften, but her eyes did slightly, in a way that acknowledged what she was asking. "Harlan Voss is coming regardless. These documents give us the legal foundation to fight him, but only if we're still standing when help arrives. I need everyone here to decide tonight whether they're going to stay. I'm not going to shame anyone who chooses to leave. He's a powerful man, and this is a real risk. But I believe we can hold this town, and I need to know who's willing to try." The church was quiet for a long moment. Patrick stood at the back, watching, and the silence had a quality to it like something about to break, the way the air feels before lightning. Then a woman named Clara Briggs, who was 50 years old and had been in Caldwell Creek since the first year, stood up and said, "I'm staying. I built something here and I'm not leaving it to Harlan Voss." After Clara, it went quickly. One by one and then in groups, every person in that church said they were staying. Not out of reckless courage. Out of something quieter and more durable than courage. Out of the refusal to be moved from what they had built. Patrick watched it happen, and he felt something in his chest that was not the old familiar numbness he'd been carrying since Millhaven. It was its opposite. Cole Ferris rode out toward Dodge City an hour later, and Rose stood in the church doorway watching him go, and Patrick came to stand beside her. "You rallied every one of them," he said. "They rallied themselves," she said. "They just needed the information." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "At Millhaven, where I was deputy, there was a man like Voss. His name was Calloway. He started with water rights too. I tried to keep things calm, tried to work the legal angles, and then when it started to get dangerous, I told myself the town was lost. I moved on before the end." Rose looked at him directly. "What happened to Millhaven?" she said. "It's still there," he said, and his voice had a complicated quality. "But 3 families lost their farms. A man named Doone, who'd been a friend of mine, lost everything he'd spent 15 years building, because the people who might have helped decided it wasn't their fight." "Is that why you've been drifting?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I reckon so," he said, "among other reasons." "You're not drifting now," she said. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." It was an acknowledgement, not quite a declaration, but it held between them in the cool night air, and neither of them walked away from it. The next 2 days were preparation, and Rose drove them with the methodical intensity of a military campaign, which was not a metaphor Patrick used lightly. She organized the town's assets with the same clarity she brought to surveying. She knew who had firearms and what condition they were in. She knew who among the farmers had experience with confrontation, and who was steadier under pressure than they appeared. She drafted the message that would go to the county sheriff, along with copies of the land documents Rose had retrieved, sending it on the Morning Post. She also did something that Patrick had not anticipated. She rode south to the boundary between the town's land and the Voss Ranch, alone, at midday on the 2nd day, with her surveying equipment. Patrick found her there an hour later, having followed her trail out of a concern that was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from something other than professional vigilance. She was kneeling beside a stake she'd driven at the corner of what the Morrison homestead documents identified as the true boundary, and she was measuring angles with her theodolite, and she was talking quietly to herself as she worked. He sat on his horse a respectful distance away and watched her establish 3 control points along the true boundary, marking each one with stakes and noting the measurements with mathematical precision in her field book. It took her nearly 2 hours, and it was genuine surveying work, not gesture or performance. When she finished, she walked over to where he'd dismounted and was waiting, and she handed him the field book, open to the pages of measurements she'd just recorded. He looked at the numbers. He understood them. He'd done enough trail work and land work to know the difference between rough estimation and precision measurement, and what he was looking at was precision measurement. "These match the Morrison documents," he said. "Within 4 inches over a 300-yard baseline," she said. "Which is inside acceptable survey tolerance for this type of instrument." He looked at her. He looked at the book again. He looked at the stakes she'd placed along the true boundary line, each one precise and intentional. "Rose," he said, and this was the first time he had used her given name, and he felt the weight of it as he said it. "This is extraordinary." She blinked, and for just a moment the professional composure shifted and something more personal and more uncertain showed through it. "It's basic survey work," she said. "It is not," he said. "This is exact enough to stand up in court. You've just independently verified the original boundary, established on record, capable of being checked against the county measurements. If Voss brings his surveyor into this, you can put your field book in front of a judge and his surveyor's work will look like what it is." She was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the distance between them was 3 feet and also about to become something much smaller. "I've been watching you work for 2 days," he said, "and I want to say something that I hope doesn't come out the wrong way." "Say it," she said. "I have known a lot of capable people," Patrick said. I have been in hard situations with men who were experienced and skilled and brave, and I've always been able to measure myself against them and know roughly where I stood. I don't know where I stand with you. You are the most formidable person I have encountered in my 31 years, and I find it honestly one of the most compelling things I've ever seen." Rose was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass between them. "You're not frightened by it," she said. It was not a question, it was more like a realization. "I'm not," he said. "I've been frightened by a lot of things. You are not one of them. You are—" He stopped, looked for the word, found it. "You are what I've been looking for without knowing it." "That probably sounds like a line." "It doesn't sound like a line," she said. "It sounds like something you're not sure you should have said." "That's accurate," he admitted. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, reading eyes, and then she said, "I've been wondering since the first morning why you were still here. You said you were passing through." "I was." "What stopped you?" "You did," he said simply. "You and the fact that this town deserves not to be abandoned." "Those are two different reasons," she said. "They've become the same reason," Patrick said. The moment stretched between them, and then they both looked away at the same time and back at the stakes in the ground, and Rose said, "We should get back." And Patrick said, "Yes." And they mounted and rode back toward Caldwell Creek, and neither of them said anything for the first mile, but they rode closer together than they needed to on that wide, flat plain. On the evening of the fourth day, Cole Ferris came back from Dodge City. He came back with good news and uncertain news. The federal circuit judge, a man named Harlan B. Cates, had reviewed the documentation Rose had sent and had agreed to issue a preliminary injunction against any forcible action pending a proper hearing. The injunction had been issued and certified, and Cole Ferris had it in his saddlebag. The uncertain news was that Judge Cates would not be able to come to Caldwell Creek for 10 days, and Harlan Voss, according to Cole's intelligence gathered along the road, was riding in the day after tomorrow. 10 days was too long. 2 days was too short. The injunction was real and binding, but injunctions only worked if the man receiving them chose to be bound by them, and Harlan Voss's history with legal paperwork that inconvenienced him was not encouraging. Rose spread the injunction on her desk that night and read it carefully. Patrick sat across from her in the schoolhouse, in a student's chair that was slightly too small for him, and waited. "The injunction prohibits any party from taking forcible action to alter the current boundaries or access rights of Caldwell Creek pending judicial review," she said. "If Voss arrives with armed men intending to redirect water access or claim the creek bank, he is in violation the moment he acts." "He's going to say he hasn't received formal notice," Patrick said. "Legal strategy. He'll claim the injunction doesn't apply until it's served." "Then we need a law officer to serve it," Rose said. "There's no marshal in town," Patrick said. "There was a deputy," Rose said, and she looked at him. The silence in the schoolhouse was complete. "My commission expired," Patrick said. "I know," Rose said, "but you know the procedures. And if Emil Hobart and 3 other witnesses observe the service, it's on record. The question is whether you're willing to walk up to Harlan Voss and hand him a federal injunction." "You know what he might do when he reads it," Patrick said. "Yes," Rose said. "I know exactly what he might do. I'm also asking you." Patrick looked at her, and the lantern light was between them, and there was something in her eyes that was not asking him to take a risk for her sake, but asking him to be the man she had already assessed him as capable of being. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated, and something relaxed in her shoulders that she had been carrying tightly for 4 days. They talked for another hour about the logistics of what would happen when Voss arrived, and at some point the conversation shifted in a way that was imperceptible and important, the way rivers shift their course over years, gradually and then all at once. They were no longer talking only about the town. They were talking about themselves, in the space around the words about the town. Rose told him about the loneliness of being the smartest person in most rooms she entered, the particular isolation of being a woman whose capabilities exceeded what the people around her expected, and often made them uncomfortable. She told him that she had come to Caldwell Creek because it needed something she could give, and because it was far enough from the places where people already had opinions about who she was supposed to be. Patrick told her about Millhaven, the whole story this time, the way he had told himself that the writing was on the wall and leaving early wasn't the same as abandoning anyone, and the way he had known, even as he rode out, that it was a lie he was telling himself. He told her that the guilt had become one of the engines of his drifting, that if he never stayed anywhere long enough to matter, he could never fail anyone again. "You stayed here," Rose said quietly. "You made it impossible to leave," he said, and this time it did not sound like anything other than the exact truth. She reached across the desk between them and placed her hand over his, and it was a gesture of extraordinary simplicity and extraordinary courage. And Patrick turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that in the quiet schoolhouse with the wind outside and the lantern burning low, and neither of them moved for a long time. On the morning of the 6th day, Harlan Voss rode into Caldwell Creek. He came with 18 men, not 20, which Rose noted as a small but potentially significant data point, suggesting either that he had encountered some logistical difficulty or that he was not expecting serious resistance. He was a tall man, lean in the way that power makes some men lean, with gray at his temples and the kind of face that had learned to be pleasant as a tool. He wore an expensive coat that was wrong for the trail, which told Patrick he had dressed for an arrival rather than a ride, which told Patrick he had planned this as a performance. Voss stopped in the middle of the main street and looked at the town with the air of a man taking inventory of something he is already considering as his own. Every soul in Caldwell Creek who could stand was standing. They were arranged along both sides of the main street, not confrontationally, not armed and ready but present, simply there. 100 people occupying their own ground, watching. Rose stood at the center in front of the general store, and Patrick stood 4 feet to her left, and he had his hand at his side near his revolver but not on it. Voss looked at the assembled town for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. He had expected frightened dispersal. He had received something else. He dismounted, and 2 of his men dismounted behind him, and he walked toward Rose with the walk of a man who was recalibrating without showing it. "You must be the schoolteacher," Voss said. He made it sound like a friendly observation. "Rose Finley," she said, "and you're Harlan Voss. I have some documents for you." She held out the certified copies of the Morrison homestead claim, and she held out the county land records from Pratt, and she held out the prior claim analysis she had written up in her neat, precise hand, and she held them out with the steadiness of someone who had no doubt whatsoever about their validity. Voss took the papers and looked at them with the practiced expression of a man who had seen a lot of documents and was deciding whether these mattered. "And that," Rose said, "is the federal injunction Mr. Graves will now serve." Patrick stepped forward and extended the injunction, and he said, clearly and for the record and in front of the witnesses assembled on both sides of the street, "Harlan Voss, this is a preliminary injunction issued by Judge Harlan B. Cates of the Federal Circuit Court, prohibiting any forcible action to alter water access or territorial boundaries in or adjacent to Caldwell Creek, pending judicial review scheduled for 10 days from today. You are hereby formally served." Voss looked at the injunction. He looked at Patrick. He looked at the town arranged on both sides of him. And the thing that Patrick had understood about powerful men in the law business was the thing that proved true in that moment. They did not survive by fighting battles they had not already won. Voss had arrived expecting a fight that was already over. He had found, instead, a fight that had been organized against him with legal precision and communal solidarity, and he was looking at both of them and calculating whether either could be broken. "Your survey is wrong," Voss said to Rose, his voice still pleasant. "My surveyor's measurements are certified by the territorial office." "Your surveyor's measurements can be challenged," Rose said. "Mine are in the field book established from the original survey stakes. The control points I used are tied to the 1872 Morrison claim, which predates your filing. I welcome the comparison in court." A long beat passed. "You did all this yourself," Voss said, and there was something in his voice that was not admiration exactly but was a form of reluctant recognition. "The survey, the documents, the injunction." "With help," Rose said, and she did not look at Patrick, but Patrick felt it all the same. Voss looked at his men, and then at the town, and then at the injunction in his hand. Patrick watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the weighing of what could be gained against what had already been lost, and the thing that men like Voss always understood eventually was that a legal trap, once properly set, was harder to escape than a physical one. "I'll see you in court," Voss said, and his voice was still pleasant. "I'm counting on it," Rose said. Voss turned and walked back to his horse, and his 18 men followed, and they rode south out of Caldwell Creek, and the town watched them go. For a moment after the last rider cleared the edge of the street, nothing moved and nobody spoke. Then Clara Briggs let out a long breath that was almost a laugh, and Emil Hobart took off his hat and pressed it to his chest, and Jimmy Hobart let out a whoop that was entirely unrestrained, and the street came alive with something that Patrick had not heard in years, the particular sound of a community discovering that it was still itself. Patrick turned to look at Rose, and Rose was looking at him, and her eyes were bright and her chin was still steady, but her hands, her extraordinary steady hands, had a slight tremor in them that she was controlling. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever witnessed," he said, "or the most prepared." "Ideally both," she said. "Definitely both," he said. He wanted to take her hands. He did not here in the middle of the main street with 100 people around them, but the wanting was entirely clear to both of them. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell Creek did not simply return to normal. It became something better than it had been before, the way metal is better after it's been properly tested by fire. People who had been strangers in the polite way of small communities became neighbors in the fuller sense, having stood together on the main street and found something real in common. Rose returned to her classroom with the same methodical dedication, and the children who had watched her stand in the main street against Harlan Voss arrived at school the following Monday with a quality of attention that she had never quite seen in them before. They were paying attention not just to the lessons but to her, in the way that young people pay attention to someone they have watched do something genuinely difficult. She taught them surveying mathematics that week with twice the enthusiasm she'd planned. Patrick did not leave. He was not immediately sure what his role in Caldwell Creek was, beyond staying, but staying turned out to have its own logic. Emil Hobart, who was on the town council, raised the question of a town marshal at the first meeting after Voss's departure, and the conversation moved to Patrick without anyone having to direct it there. He was offered the position at a salary he negotiated with polite firmness, and he accepted it. He began walking the streets and knowing the people, and the people began knowing him, and the particular satisfaction of useful work in a specific place began filling in the hollows that 3 years of drifting had worn into him. He and Rose saw each other often, which in a town of 100 people was inevitable, but they also saw each other deliberately. He came to the schoolhouse in the evenings, ostensibly to review land records and coordinate on the upcoming judicial hearing. The land records were genuinely reviewed. The coordination was genuine, and the evenings extended past what coordination strictly required, and neither of them appeared to mind. Rose taught him the finer points of survey mathematics that he hadn't fully grasped, drawing diagrams on the schoolhouse chalkboard with the same clarity she used with her students. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he was an attentive student. He had spent his life acquiring practical skills without formal instruction, and the experience of someone teaching him methodically, without condescension and with evident pleasure in the teaching, was something new. "You learn quickly," she told him one evening, when he'd worked through a set of calculations without error. "I had a good teacher," he said, and meant it entirely. She looked at the board for a moment and then she said, without looking at him, "You are not what I expected when you rode into town." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would offer loud help and then leave when it got complicated," she said. "The way most people do." "I nearly did," he said honestly. "I sat in the saloon and told myself it wasn't my business." "What changed your mind?" "I heard you teaching," he said. "Through the window. You were telling the children that they needed to be able to read a survey because land was the foundation of everything their families had. And I thought," he paused, "I thought that was the most honest thing anyone had said in my hearing in years, and I didn't want to be the person who rode past it." Rose turned from the chalkboard and looked at him fully, and the quality of her gaze was different from the careful, measuring look she had turned on him in their first days. It was open in a way that was, Patrick understood, something she did rarely and with great deliberateness. "Patrick," she said. The use of his given name in her voice was something he felt in his whole chest. "I want to tell you something, and I want to be precise about it, because imprecision in important matters is a habit I don't have." "Go ahead," he said. "I think I love you," she said. "I am approximately 80% certain that what I feel is love, and I am 100% certain that I have never been 80% certain about anything involving another person before, which in itself seems significant." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, which was not the response she appeared to have entirely expected, but it was a warm laugh, a real one, the kind that comes from being delighted rather than amused. "Rose," he said, "I am 100% certain. I have been certain for 2 weeks. I have been trying to say it without making it sound like something less than it is." She looked at him with those precise, reading eyes. "Say it then," she said. "Precisely." "I love you," he said. "Not because you needed help and I gave it, or because the situation made it convenient. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because being near you makes me feel like the person I was supposed to be before I stopped believing I could be him. That is as precise as I can make it." Rose was quiet for a moment, and her face was doing something complicated and honest, the way faces do when they have been held still for a long time and are being allowed to move freely. "That's quite precise," she said. "Will it do?" he asked. "It will more than do," she said. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her hands, and they were the hands he had been watching for 2 weeks, capable and steady, and slightly ink-stained from the documents she'd been copying all day. And he held them in his and looked at her face in the lantern light, and thought that this was the thing he had been drifting toward without knowing it, across all those empty miles. He kissed her with the same honesty he'd used to say the words, and she kissed him back with the same precision she brought to everything. The judicial hearing came on the 11th day, and it was held in the church, which served as the most formal space available, with Judge Harlan B. Cates presiding from behind the pulpit in a way that would have seemed irreverent to some and practically inevitable to others. Voss appeared with his surveyor and his lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Wichita named Aldrich who had a gift for paperwork and a confident posture that did not entirely survive his first encounter with Rose Finley. Rose presented her case with the organized clarity of someone who had been preparing for this specific argument for 3 weeks. She presented the Morrison Homestead documents. She presented the certified copies from the Pratt Land Office. She presented her own survey field book, walked Judge Cates through the methodology, and invited comparison with the Voss survey on any specific point. Aldrich attempted to challenge the survey methodology, suggesting that an instrument of the kind Rose had used was insufficiently precise for legal determination. Rose produced the specifications of her theodolite, which she had purchased from a surveying supply company in Kansas City 2 years earlier, demonstrated its calibration procedure, and explained in detail why the precision tolerance she had achieved was not only adequate for legal purposes, but exceeded the precision of the territorial survey Voss was relying on. Judge Cates asked her 3 technical questions about survey procedure. She answered all 3 with the specificity of a professional. Voss's surveyor, who was being asked to dispute this in open court, said little. At the end of the hearing, Judge Cates ruled that the original boundary established by the Morrison homestead claim remained in force, that the creek's east bank constituted the boundary of the public easement, and that Voss's competing survey filing was, in the judge's words, materially inconsistent with the established record and insufficient to overcome prior claim. The creek belonged to Caldwell Creek. When the judge made his ruling, the church erupted in a way that churches rarely did, and Clara Briggs hugged Rose with the force of a woman who had been carrying fear for weeks and was setting it down. And Emil Hobart shook Patrick's hand with a grip that communicated more than words required, and Jimmy Hobart climbed onto a pew and cheered until his father pulled him down. Rose stood at the center of it all and received it with the grace of someone who had done what needed to be done and was genuinely glad it had worked, but was already thinking about what came next, which was one of the things Patrick loved most about her. He reached her through the crowd and she looked up at him, and there were unshed tears in her eyes, not from grief, but from the particular overwhelm of a thing going right after enormous effort. And he wanted to put his arms around her, and he did not because there were 100 people watching, and he did not know yet if she would want that. She solved the problem by putting her hand on his arm, lightly, briefly, in front of everyone, and it was a small gesture, but it was perfectly unambiguous, and several people noticed, and the ones who noticed smiled. Harlan Voss left Caldwell Creek for the last time that afternoon. He did not look back. In the weeks that followed the hearing, something settled over the town that was not quite peace, since peace is passive, but something more active and harder one. People planted winter crops with more investment than they had in years. Emil Hobart expanded the general store. A family named Wren who had been considering leaving decided to stay and applied for a homestead claim on the eastern edge of the county, which Rose helped them file correctly, gratis, on a Saturday morning. Patrick built Caldwell Creek, a proper marshal's office, with the help of several men who showed up, unbidden on a Tuesday morning with lumber and tools. It was not a large building, a single room with a desk and a holding cell that was more symbolic than structural, but it was solid, and it was the first time in 3 years Patrick had built something with the intention of remaining in its vicinity. He asked Rose to dinner at a proper establishment, which in Caldwell Creek meant the back room of the saloon where the Dusty Angel's owner, a dignified woman named Mrs. Shan, served meals on actual tablecloths on special occasions. He wore his cleanest shirt, and he brought flowers, which took more effort to obtain in Kansas in November than one might expect. Rose wore a dress he had not seen before, dark blue, with her dark hair pinned up in a way that was different from how she wore it for school and surveying, and she looked at him across the table with the directness that was entirely Rose and entirely one of the things he was most in love with. They talked about everything and nothing, the way couples do when they are in the early flush of discovery, and every ordinary subject becomes interesting in each other's company. They talked about the students she was worried about, and the ones who had lately startled her with their progress. They talked about the plans the town council was making for the spring, including a proposal to extend the school building that Rose had been advocating for since her arrival. They talked about Patrick's work and the small, mostly minor problems of frontier law enforcement in a small town where most people were essentially decent. At the end of the evening, walking back through the quiet main street with the stars enormous above them, Patrick said, "Rose, I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "I want to spend a considerable amount of time in your company," he said, "ideally all of the time. I want to be the person you come home to and the person you tell things to and the person who is there when something matters. I am asking specifically if you will marry me." Rose stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at him for a moment in the starlight and he waited, because Rose Finley always answered after she had thought and her thoughts were worth waiting for. "I have a counter-proposal," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "I will marry you," she said, with the condition that you understand what that means. I will continue teaching. I will continue surveying when surveying is needed. I will not become less than what I am because the arrangement of our lives changes. Rose, he said with complete sincerity, the day you become less than what you are is the day I have failed at something fundamental. I am not asking you to be smaller. I am asking you to stay. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, yes. He took her hands, those ink-stained and capable hands, and she looked up at him with her clear, direct eyes, and he thought that he was the luckiest man in Kansas, which was a large and competitive field. They were married in the Caldwell Creek church on a Saturday in December of 1882, which was the coldest month anyone could remember, and the church was so full that people stood along the walls and in the doorway wrapped in coats. Mrs. Shan made the wedding cake, which was extravagant and delicious. Jimmy Hobart served as an unofficial usher with a seriousness that was both touching and faintly comical. Clara Briggs cried with undisguised enthusiasm. The Reverend performed the ceremony with genuine feeling, and when it came time for the vows, Patrick looked at Rose and said everything he meant, and Rose looked at Patrick and said everything she meant with the precision that was her nature, and the church was very quiet while they said it. In the spring, Cole Ferris found a homestead claim north of town and asked Rose if she would help him survey the corners. She did, and she brought Patrick, and the three of them walked the frozen winter ground in the early spring thaw, and Rose explained as she worked, because she could not help explaining when she worked, and Cole said she should charge for this kind of help, and Rose said that being useful to the community was its own payment, and besides she enjoyed it. The school extension was approved in March, and construction began in April. The new wing added 2 additional classrooms, which meant that the older students and younger students could be taught separately, which improved the quality of both lessons considerably. Rose hired an assistant teacher, a woman named Frances Dole, who had just arrived from Kansas City with a teaching certificate and a formidable enthusiasm, and the two of them reorganized the entire curriculum over several Sunday afternoons in a way that Patrick, observing from the doorway once, described as a military campaign for children's minds. That's a compliment, he clarified. I know, Rose said, not looking up from the curriculum document she was annotating. By the summer of 1883, it became clear that Rose was expecting a child. She told Patrick on a Tuesday evening after school, sitting at her desk in the way she always sat when she had something important to say, directly and with her hands folded on the desk. She told him the facts as she knew them calmly, in the manner of a woman reporting a significant data point. Patrick sat down in the student chair that was still too small for him and looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am entirely well," she said. "I intend to continue teaching through the fall semester and into winter, as long as it is medically sensible to do so. Frances can manage the classroom if necessary, but I would prefer to maintain my role for as long as possible." "Of course," he said. "Are you?" She paused in the precise way that indicated she was choosing a word carefully. "Glad." He got up and went to her and knelt down beside her chair and took her hands and said, "Rose, I am more glad than I have language for. I am terrified and delighted, and I think about the kind of person you are going to be to a child, and I feel—" He stopped, and his voice was rougher than he intended. "I feel like I have been given something I did not earn." "That is the definition of a gift," she said, and her voice was soft in the way it was only very occasionally, the way that said she had let the precision down for a moment. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands and stayed like that for a moment, and she put her free hand on his hair, and the schoolhouse was quiet around them. Their son was born in January of 1884, in the middle of a snowstorm that Patrick spent entirely in the next room, being absolutely useless and periodically checked on by Clara Briggs, who had appointed herself the household's unofficial supervisor of the birth process. Clara had attended enough frontier births to know what normal looked like, and had the manner of someone who expected things to go well and helped ensure they did. The baby was healthy and loud about it, and Patrick was brought into the room by Clara at a moment that was, in his experience, one of the most significant of his life, and he sat beside Rose, who was exhausted and radiant and entirely herself, and held his son for the first time, and felt the small weight of this new person and was entirely undone. "He's remarkable," Patrick said. "He's 4 hours old," Rose said. "He's remarkable," Patrick repeated with conviction. They named him Henry James Graves, the James for Rose's father whose engineering precision she had inherited, and the Henry for no particular reason, except that they both liked it and it suited him. Henry James Graves was a remarkably alert baby who seemed interested in everything, which his mother took as confirmation of his intelligence, and his father took as evidence that he was already causing trouble, and both were probably right. Life in Caldwell Creek continued in the way that good life in good places does, with the texture of ordinary days and the occasional interruption of something larger. Patrick's position as town marshal became, over time, what a good marshal's position should be, primarily a matter of calm presence and the occasional dispute resolution rather than drawn guns and confrontations. The worst incident of 1884 was a disagreement between two farmers over a fence line, which Rose offered to help resolve by surveying the relevant boundary, which she did one afternoon while Patrick supervised to ensure nobody became irate, and the matter was settled without further drama. Rose continued to teach, continued to survey when surveying was needed, and continued to be the kind of person who made the community around her more capable of solving its own problems, which she always considered the highest form of usefulness. She began writing a series of articles for the Pratt County newspaper on the practical aspects of land claims and boundary establishment for frontier homesteaders, written in plain language that anyone could understand, and they were received with such enthusiasm that the paper asked her to make it a regular column. The school continued to grow, and Frances Dole proved to be an excellent teacher who shared Rose's philosophy about the importance of practical knowledge, and between them they produced a generation of Caldwell Creek children who knew how to read a survey, understand a land document, and write a clear argument, skills that Patrick observed with deep satisfaction would serve them all their lives. In the fall of 1885, Patrick received a letter from Millhaven. It was from a man named Doone. He read it twice and then brought it to Rose, because bringing things to Rose was what he did now with things that mattered, not because he needed her to solve them, but because her presence made him more certain of his own clarity. Doone had written to say that Millhaven was doing well. The man who had broken it 3 years ago had eventually moved on to other targets, and the town had slowly rebuilt. Doone's farm was not fully recovered, but he had managed to hold onto the core of it, and he had remarried, and things were not what they had been, but they were not nothing either. He had found Patrick through the records at the county office, following the chain of post addresses, and he wrote to say that he held Patrick no grievance. Patrick sat with the letter for a long time. "He doesn't blame you," Rose said. "I still blame myself," Patrick said. "A little." "A little seems appropriate," Rose said. "A little is honest. All of it would be excessive. You stayed here, Patrick. Whatever you didn't do in Millhaven, you did here." He looked at her. "You always know what the precise truth is," he said. "Not always," she said, with the faint smile that meant she was being modest about something she was actually fairly confident of. "But in this case, yes." He wrote back to Doone that same evening, a letter that was genuine and not brief, and after he sent it he felt something shift in the old weight he'd been carrying, not disappear but settle into a different position, one that was less of a burden and more of a scar, which is what old guilts become when you have actually done enough good to carry them honestly. Henry learned to walk in the spring of 1885 and immediately applied this new skill to getting into every possible thing in the schoolhouse. Rose handled this with characteristic practicality by assigning him a corner of the room with a set of blocks she had ordered from Kansas City and a small chalkboard of his own, and he sat there in the mornings contentedly, while his mother taught and drew things that he explained to her, in a running commentary, that the older students found either charming or deeply distracting depending on their disposition. Patrick came by the school one afternoon and found his son with his face covered in chalk and explaining his drawing to Francis Dole with the earnest conviction of someone who has very important things to communicate. And he stood in the doorway laughing quietly for a full minute before Rose noticed him and gave him the look that said she was equally amused, but was professionally obligated not to show it. By the winter of 1885, with Henry just under 2 years old, Rose told Patrick that she was expecting again. 2, he said. Apparently, she agreed. Henry is going to be either an excellent or a catastrophic older brother, Patrick said. Both, probably at different times, Rose said. Like most people. The second child, born in the hot July of 1886, was a girl. She arrived with all the confidence of someone who had already decided exactly who she was, which was a characteristic that Patrick found entirely familiar and told Rose made him nervous for entirely different reasons than Henry. "She looks exactly like you," he said, looking at his daughter with the same undone feeling he had experienced with Henry, multiplied in a way he hadn't anticipated. "She looks like herself," Rose said, with the tired clarity of a woman who has just done something very hard and very worthwhile and knows exactly how to assess the result. They named her Clara, after Clara Briggs, who had been present at both births and had become one of the foundational supports of their life in Caldwell Creek, in the way that certain people become foundational without anyone formally designating them so. Clara Briggs, upon hearing the name, sat down in her chair at the christening and pressed her handkerchief to her face and said it was the dust, and everyone politely agreed that it probably was. The years settled into the pattern of a life that is both ordinary and rich in the way that only lives embedded in community can be. Patrick and Rose were not people of dramatic declarations. They expressed love in the daily texture of choosing each other, in the conversation over the breakfast table and the walk home from the school in the evenings when the children were finally asleep, and the house was quiet, and they sat together on the porch with the enormous Kansas sky above them. Patrick never lost the quality of attention that Rose had noticed in him from the earliest days, the way he listened, the way he was genuinely interested in what she thought about things. Rose never lost the precision and capability that Patrick had fallen in love with, never diminished it to make anyone more comfortable, and Patrick never once wanted her to. They argued occasionally, as people do who are both capable and opinionated, and their arguments had the quality of their other conversations, substantive and specific and resolved. Rose had a particular gift for identifying the exact point of disagreement and naming it plainly, which was occasionally irritating in the moment and almost always clarifying afterward. And Patrick had a gift for seeing past the immediate surface of a problem to what was actually at stake, which complemented hers in ways that sometimes surprised them both. Henry grew up to be thoughtful and somewhat serious, with his mother's mathematical mind and his father's steadiness. By the time he was 8, he was helping his mother with simple survey calculations on Saturday mornings, holding the chain tape while she set up the theodolite, handing her stakes with the solemnity of a surgical assistant, and Rose taught him with the same patience and exactness she brought to everything, without condescension. Clara grew up to be bold and sociable and intensely interested in everything that moved, which in Kansas was considerable. She had a particular passion for horses that Patrick recognized as instinctive rather than learned, and by the time she was 5, she had opinions about every horse in the livery stable, and Jimmy Hobart, who had taken over the livery from his father, consulted her seriously. The school continued to be at the center of Rose's life, and at the center of the community's life, and the children who passed through her classroom carried with them something that lasted beyond the subject matter, the understanding that learning was how you defended what mattered, that knowledge was not separate from life, but was the tool by which life was made more fully your own. Some of those children grew up to be farmers and ranchers and tradespeople. Several went on to higher education. One of them, a girl named Mabel Ferris, who was Cole Ferris's daughter, eventually became a lawyer, and she sent Rose a letter when she was admitted to the bar that Rose kept in the desk drawer alongside her survey field book from the Voss dispute, the two documents that most represented what she had built in Caldwell Creek. In the autumn of 1887, 5 years after Harlan Voss had ridden out of Caldwell Creek for the last time, Rose was asked to present her survey methodology and her land claim analysis before a state geological survey conference in Topeka. She was, as far as anyone knew, the first woman ever invited to present at this conference, and the invitation caused a degree of quiet controversy among some of the organizing committee that she ignored with complete equanimity. Patrick drove her and the children to the train station at Pratt on a cool October morning, Henry and Clara both dressed in their best clothes with varying degrees of enthusiasm about this requirement, and he lifted her satchel onto the train for her and stood on the platform and looked at her in the morning light. "You're going to be the most capable person in that room," he said. "Probably," she agreed, without false modesty. "You're going to be taken aback at first," he said. Some of them always are," she said. "They adjust." "Yes, they do," he said. And then quietly, "I'm proud of you. I want to say that clearly." Rose looked at him, and she was 42 years old now, and the years had settled into her face in the way of a woman who has lived fully and well, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been on that first morning in the main street, because beauty, he had learned, deepened with understanding. "I know," she said. "I know you are." And she meant it as the full statement it was, that she knew and was grateful, and that his pride in her was one of the foundations she stood on. She kissed him on the platform in front of the children, which made Henry look away with the mortified expression of a 9-year-old and made Clara clap. "Behave yourselves," Rose told Henry and Clara. "Do what your father says and feed the cat." "Be brilliant," Patrick told Rose. "I intend to," she said, and boarded the train. Patrick stood on the platform with his children and watched the train go, and Henry came and stood beside him and said, with 9-year-old gravity, "She's going to be the best one there, isn't she?" "She is," Patrick said. "Good," Henry said with satisfaction, and took his father's hand, and Clara took the other, and they walked back to the wagon in the morning light. Rose came back from Topeka 4 days later, with a report that the conference had gone extremely well, that she had presented her methodology to an audience that was initially skeptical and eventually asking so many questions that her session had run 40 minutes over time, and that she had been invited to contribute to the State Geological Survey's manual on boundary establishment methodology, which meant that her surveying approach would eventually be taught to every county surveyor in Kansas. She told Patrick all of this in the straightforward manner in which she told him everything, and then she said, "The man who introduced me called me a remarkable surveyor. He didn't say for a woman, he just said remarkable." "Because you are," Patrick said. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." And it was not arrogance but accuracy, the same accuracy she brought to measurements, and he loved her for it entirely. The years rolled on, as years do, in the particular way of the Kansas plains, with seasons that were each their own kind of extreme, and a beauty that required patience to fully appreciate. Henry and Clara grew, and the school grew, and Caldwell Creek grew, and the creek itself continued to flow along its proper boundary, belonging to the town that had fought to keep it. There came a day in the spring of 1890 when Patrick and Rose walked the creek bank in the late afternoon, the way they sometimes walked on Sunday afternoons when the children were occupied and the day was clear. The cottonwoods along the bank were in new leaf, that particular bright green of early spring, and the water was running full with snowmelt from the north. Patrick stopped at the place where Rose had driven her first survey stake 7.5 years earlier, the place where she had established the true boundary. The stake was long gone, but he knew the spot. "Here," he said. Rose looked at the ground. She knew the spot, too. "Here," she confirmed. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something he had been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment, which was a habit he had when he wanted to say something important. He held it out to her. It was a compass, a fine surveying compass with a brass case, and engraved on the back in careful letters were the words, Rose Finley Graves, Caldwell Creek, Kansas. The truth is in the measurement. She took it and read the engraving and looked at him, and she was 40 years old and the woman he had loved for 8 years, and the mother of his children and the teacher of half a generation of Caldwell Creek citizens. And she was also the same woman who had been kneeling beside a survey stake in the early morning when he first understood who she was. The truth is in the measurement, she said. You said something like that to the children once, he said. I wrote it down. She held the compass in her palm, solid and exact, and looked at him with the full direct gaze that had been one of the first things he had loved about her. I have something to tell you, she said. Tell me. I'm expecting again, she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he laughed, the warm, real laugh, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out over the creek and the green Kansas plain. 3, he said. 3, she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood at the creek bank with the water running clear and the cottonwood leaves bright above them and the town behind them. The town that had not been finished. The town that had refused to be finished, and everything about it was exactly as it should be, real and earned and theirs. The third child, born in the winter of 1890, was another boy. They named him James Thomas Graves, James again for Rose's father, Thomas for Patrick's, a joining of lineages that both of them found fitting. He was a placid and enormous baby who slept well and ate enthusiastically, and regarded everything with an air of benign satisfaction, which Henry declared meant he was going to be a farmer, which Clara declared meant he was going to be a cook, and which Rose declared meant he was an individual person who would become whatever he chose. She always does that, Henry told Clara. She's always right, Clara said. She was, in this as in most things, right. Caldwell Creek, in the years that followed, became the kind of town that people chose rather than fell into. A place with a reputation for fairness and capability, where the school was genuinely excellent and the land records were scrupulously maintained, and the marshal was known for being both firm and reasonable. People told stories about the schoolteacher who had held off Harlan Voss with a field book and a federal injunction, and the stories grew in the telling the way stories do. But the truth at their center was more remarkable than the embellishments, because the truth was that Rose Finley had looked at a town about to be broken and had chosen, methodically and completely, to rebuild it from the ground up. Patrick Graves, who had ridden into Caldwell Creek with a cracked saddle and an intention to leave, never left. He was the marshal for 14 years, until he was 45 and his knees complained about the cold with growing insistence. And then he became something harder to name but equally essential, the man who knew the history of the town and where the boundaries ran and what had been worth fighting for. He and Rose grew old together in the way of people who have chosen each other fully, with the accumulated tenderness of years and the ongoing pleasure of being with someone whose mind you find endlessly interesting. They kept walking on Sunday afternoons along the creek bank, even when their pace slowed, even when it became Henry who walked beside them instead of opposite them. The compass Rose had received at the bank was kept on her desk, and eventually, when she finally stepped down from teaching at 62, passed to Francis Dole, who had kept the school with the same spirit, and passed it to a third teacher who had been one of Rose's students. Henry became, as it turned out, an engineer, following the lineage of his grandfather James and his mother's surveying mind into the formal discipline, and went to study in Kansas City and came back to practice in the county. Clara became a veterinarian, a path that required considerable persistence in an era that resisted it, and she brought to that resistance the same equanimity her mother had always modeled for her. James Thomas Graves became, to everyone's mild surprise and complete approval, a teacher himself, and he had his mother's clarity and his father's patience and his students, all through his long career in 3 Kansas counties, were among the best educated people in the state. On a morning in the spring of 1905, Patrick and Rose sat on the porch of the house they had shared for 23 years, with coffee that was getting better now that the supply lines were reliable, and with the habit of comfortable silence that is the mark of people who have been talking to each other for a long time and trust the quiet as much as the words. The main street of Caldwell Creek was visible from where they sat, and it was a morning street with the particular unhurried quality of a town that knows what it is and is content with it. The school bell rang at 8 as it always had, and they could hear it clearly. "Hear that?" Patrick said. 31 children last count, Rose said. Francis said enrollment is up. "You're going to go down there and reorganize the curriculum," he said. "I might offer a few suggestions," she said. "Francis will welcome them," he said. "Francis always says she will," Rose said with a faint smile. "And then she does it her own way, which is almost always better than my suggestion." "Imagine that," Patrick said. "Someone who learned from you and then exceeded the instruction." "That's the point of teaching," Rose said. He looked at her, his wife of 23 years, and she looked at him, and the morning light was on them both, and the creek ran along the northern edge of town where it had always run, and the town was precisely where it had always been, on its proper ground, established and verified, belonging to the people who had chosen to stay. "I should have kept riding," he said. "When I rode in that October, I was going to keep going." "I know," she said. "What do you think would have happened if you hadn't been in the street that morning?" "I think you would have ridden on," she said. "And I think you'd have been the poorer for it, and so would I, and so would this town." "I think that's right," he said. "I usually am," she said gently, because the precision was also tenderness now after all these years. He reached over and took her hand, as he had 10,000 times, and held it, as he intended to hold it for all the remaining times there were. And the bell had stopped ringing, and the school day in Caldwell Creek had begun, and the creek ran clear and constant along its true and proper boundary, and everything was exactly, precisely where it was supposed to be.